The bullet that killed Charlie Storms in Tombstone on February 25, 1881, came not from a gunfight over land or cattle, but from a poker game gone wrong 3 nights earlier. Luke Short, the gambler who fired that shot, had been caught using a holdout device up his sleeve, a spring-loaded contraption that could deliver an ace into his palm faster than the human eye could track. What transformed a simple accusation of cheating into a fatal shooting, and why did the mechanisms of frontier gambling create conditions where a man's life could be wagered on the speed of a concealed spring? The mythology of the Old West gambler centers on cool nerve and quick draws, but the reality involved mechanical ingenuity that would impress a Swiss watchmaker and social manipulation that anticipated modern confidence schemes by decades. When thousands of migrants pushed westward after the Civil War, they carried gold dust, land deeds, army pay, and cattle money into territories where legal infrastructure barely existed. Saloons became the de facto financial centers of boom towns from Deadwood to Dodge City, and professional gamblers followed that money with the dedication of bankers opening branch offices. These men were not romantic outlaws, but calculating entrepreneurs who understood something crucial about frontier economics. When law enforcement is scarce and disputes must be settled privately, the appearance of legitimacy becomes more valuable than honesty itself. The gambling apparatus that flooded into Western territories after 1865 represented the cutting edge of Victorian-era fraud technology, much of it manufactured in Cincinnati, San Francisco, and Chicago by craftsmen who never set foot in a saloon. If you're watching because you want to understand how the frontier actually worked, not how Hollywood portrayed it, make sure you're subscribed, because we're digging into the documented mechanisms, the court records, and the newspaper accounts that reveal how systematic deception shaped settlement patterns and power structures across the West. The firms that produced marked cards, weighted dice, and dealing boxes with hidden levers operated openly, advertising in trade publications that circulated among professional gamblers like technical manuals. The H.C. Evans Company of Chicago published a catalog in 1887 featuring over 200 cheating devices, from simple card trimmers that could shave 1/8 of an inch off specific cards to make them identifiable by touch, to elaborate roulette wheels with electromagnetic brakes controlled by a floor pedal. George Devil, a Mississippi riverboat gambler who later worked the railroad towns of Kansas and Nebraska, published his memoir in 1887 and detailed the economics of his profession with startling candor. He calculated that between 1850 and 1885, he won approximately $2 million, most of it through a card manipulation technique called the 3-card Monte that relied not on hidden devices, but on psychological principles refined over thousands of performances. Devil's innovation was recognizing that frontier towns created ideal conditions for his operation. Transient populations with no social networks to warn them, limited communication between settlements that prevented reputation from traveling faster than he did, and a legal environment where victims had little recourse even when they suspected fraud. He would arrive in a cattle town at the height of the season, set up in a saloon with a Confederate posing as a drunk cowhand who kept winning, and extract thousands of dollars before moving to the next railroad stop. His timing was choreographed to the migration calendar. He knew exactly when Texas drovers would arrive in Abilene with cash, when miners in Deadwood would be flush from recent strikes, and when Army payday would flood military outposts with soldiers holding 3 months of wages. The most sophisticated cheating operations required partnerships between gamblers and saloon owners, creating institutional fraud that transformed individual deception into business infrastructure. In places like Leadville, Colorado, during the silver boom of 1878 to 1880, certain saloons functioned as what modern law enforcement would call criminal enterprises, with every game rigged and every employee complicit. The California Concert Hall in Leadville employed a dealer named John Bull, who specialized in operating a faro box, the most popular gambling game in the Old West, that had been modified by a Kansas City mechanic named Will Edson. Edson's innovation was a dealing box with a curved interior track that allowed an experienced dealer to control not just the top card, but the sequence of several cards by varying the pressure applied while sliding them out. The modification was invisible to players, but required weeks of practice to operate smoothly. Bull practiced 8 hours daily for a month before the owners trusted him with the device at a live table. The profit margin justified the investment. Court records from an 1880 lawsuit reveal that the California Concert Hall extracted an average of $1,200 nightly from its rigged faro table, an amount equivalent to roughly $40,000 in modern currency. The spread of cheating technology across the frontier followed the same routes as legitimate commerce carried by the express companies and railroads that connected isolated settlements to manufacturing centers. When the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway reached Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1879, professional gamblers arrived on the same trains that brought lumber, dry goods, and agricultural equipment. Among them was a man named Canada Bill Jones, who had made a fortune on riverboats and was transitioning to railroad work. Jones specialized in a version of three-card Monte so refined that he once proposed to a railroad company that they pay him a salary to stop working their trains because he was costing them customers. The railroad declined, but the offer reveals how thoroughly gambling fraud had integrated into the economic ecosystem of Western expansion. Jones traveled with a portable toolkit that included multiple decks of cards prepared in different ways. Some with nearly invisible edge markings that indicated suit and value, some with subtle texture variations created by coating specific cards with a thin layer of wax, and some that were simply shaved to be identifiable by a trained touch while dealing. The technical specifications of these marked decks illuminated the intersection of industrial manufacturing and frontier crime. The best marked cards were produced by legitimate playing card companies in New York and Boston, whose quality control departments supposedly destroyed misprints and production errors, but in reality sold them to middlemen who knew the frontier market. A printer named Samuel Hart, whose company produced standard bicycle brand cards, also ran a side operation that created what gamblers called readers, cards with minute alterations to the pattern on the back that indicated the value and suit to someone who knew what to look for. The marks were often disguised as intentional design elements: a flower petal that pointed slightly left on aces, a curve in a vine that was fractionally thicker on face cards, variations so subtle that even a suspicious player examining the deck might dismiss them as printing inconsistencies. The real innovation was standardization. By creating consistent marking systems across multiple decks, manufacturers allowed gamblers to develop pattern recognition skills that could be applied universally. A professional who learned to read one hard deck could read them all, transforming individual fraud into a transferable skill. Weather conditions in frontier saloons influenced cheating methods in ways that modern viewers might not anticipate. The Gem Theater in Deadwood during the winter of 1876 to 1877 became a case study in environmental adaptation of fraud techniques. With temperatures often dropping below zero and pot-bellied stoves creating dramatic temperature gradients across the room, paper cards became unreliable. They warped from humidity, became sticky from the fog of tobacco smoke and body heat, and wore visibly after just a few hours of play. A gambler named James Rogers responded by switching to a scam that exploited these conditions rather than fighting them. He would bring fresh decks to the table every few hours, a practice that seemed hygienic and professional but allowed him to introduce prearranged sequences. The constant deck changes, which would have seemed suspicious in a temperature-controlled environment, appeared necessary given the visible deterioration of the cards. Rogers coordinated with the saloon's dealer to memorize specific sequences, turning the appearance of fairness into a mechanism for systematic fraud. The legal response to gambling fraud reveals much about how frontier communities actually functioned versus how territorial law claimed they should function. When town councils and territorial legislatures passed anti-gambling statutes, enforcement depended entirely on local power dynamics rather than written law. Dodge City, Kansas, during its peak cattle drive years from 1876 to 1885, officially prohibited gambling, but in practice allowed it under a licensing system that generated substantial municipal revenue. The city's ordinances created a profitable contradiction. Gambling was illegal, but operating without a license was more illegal. This structure gave city officials leverage over saloon owners while ensuring that gambling revenue continued to flow. When cheating scandals became public enough to threaten this arrangement, the response was calibrated not to the severity of the fraud but to its visibility. A gambler caught using a holdout device in a backroom poker game might be privately warned and fined. The same offense committed at a main floor faro table where prominent cattlemen had lost money might result in immediate expulsion from town. Not because the crime was worse, but because public exposure threatened the licensing system's legitimacy. The Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City, co-owned by Chalk Beeson and later by Luke Short, exemplified this calculated tolerance. The establishment employed professional dealers who were expected to maintain a specific profit margin, creating institutional pressure to cheat when necessary to meet financial targets. A dealer named Ben Thompson, who worked the Long Branch in 1879, later testified in an unrelated court case that he was instructed to ensure the house won at least 60% of significant bets using whatever methods necessary as long as they remained undetected. This arrangement shifted risk from owners to dealers. If a dealer was caught, he alone faced consequences, but if he failed to meet profit expectations, he lost his position. The structure created a class of professional cheaters who developed reputations for technical skill rather than dishonesty, a subtle but crucial distinction in frontier social hierarchies. A dealer known for using marked cards but never getting caught earned respect for competence. One who was publicly exposed brought shame not primarily for cheating but for being incompetent at it. The role of violence in settling cheating accusations followed patterns that contradicted the popular image of immediate gunfights. Statistical analysis of newspaper accounts from frontier towns between 1870 and 1890 reveals that accusations of cheating resulted in shootings less than 5% of the time. The other 95% were resolved through social mechanisms that preserved the gambling economy while allowing accusers to save face. When a player accused a dealer of using a rigged faro box in Tombstone's Oriental Saloon in 1880, the house protocol was to immediately bring in a neutral arbiter, usually another professional gambler with a reputation for fairness, who would examine the equipment and interview witnesses. If the accusation proved credible, the standard resolution involved returning the accused player's losses, barring the dealer from that specific establishment, and treating the matter as closed. This system worked because all parties had incentives to avoid violence. Gamblers needed saloons to work in. Saloon owners needed gamblers to attract customers, and players needed venues where they could gamble. Killing disrupted this ecosystem in ways that cost everyone money. The exceptions to this pattern were instructive precisely because they revealed what conditions made violence more likely than negotiation. The shooting of Charlie Storms by Luke Short began not with the cheating itself, but with Storms's refusal to accept the standard resolution. Short had been caught using a sleeve holdout during a poker game at the Oriental Saloon, and the house had offered to return Storms's losses and bar Short for a month. Storms, however, was a professional gambler himself who had recently arrived from the mining camps of Colorado, where he had built a reputation for refusing to tolerate cheating under any circumstances. His refusal to accept the settlement created a social crisis. If Short could cheat Storms without facing personal consequences, Short's status would rise while Storms's would collapse. The shooting occurred not in the saloon but 3 days later on the street, after both men had separately concluded that their professional reputations required a confrontation. The detail that often gets lost in sensationalized accounts is that Short had the choice between leaving town or facing Storms. He chose confrontation because leaving would have branded him as both a cheater and a coward, effectively ending his career in Arizona territory. Better to kill Storms and face a possible murder charge than to accept social death. The telegraph's arrival in frontier towns after 1868 gradually transformed the economics of gambling fraud by enabling reputation to travel faster than individual gamblers. Before telegraphic communication, a professional cheat could work one town until exposure, move 300 miles, and start fresh with no one aware of his history. The expansion of Western Union lines across the plains created an informal intelligence network among saloon owners and professional gamblers who would wire warnings about known cheaters. By the mid-1880s, a gambler expelled from a Denver saloon for using marked cards might find that news had reached Cheyenne, Santa Fe, and Kansas City before he could complete the train journey to any of them. This communication infrastructure forced an evolution in cheating techniques toward methods that were either impossible to prove or could be plausibly denied. The crude mechanical devices that defined the 1870s gave way to psychological manipulation and team-based cons that left no physical evidence. The soap racket perfected by Jefferson Randolph Soapy Smith in Denver and later Creede, Colorado, demonstrated this evolution, Smith's operation from 1886 to 1892 involved selling bars of soap to crowds, some supposedly wrapped with currency ranging from $1 to $100. The setup appeared to be a lottery or game of chance, but in reality, every bar that contained money went to a Confederate in the crowd whose enthusiastic winning encouraged genuine customers to buy. The genius of the operation was its layered legality. Smith was technically selling soap at inflated prices, not operating a gambling game. When Denver authorities attempted to prosecute him in 1889, the case collapsed because proving fraud required demonstrating that he had promised customers would win money. But Smith had always carefully claimed he was selling soap with occasional prizes. The verbal precision turned potential criminal charges into civil complaints about overpriced merchandise, which generated fines rather than imprisonment. Smith's organization in Creede, where he relocated after Denver became too hostile, functioned as a prototype for organized crime structures that wouldn't become common until Prohibition. He employed lookouts to identify wealthy marks arriving in town, steerers to direct them to his establishments, ropers to engage them in conversation and assess their vulnerability, and shills to pose as satisfied customers or lucky winners. The operation's sophistication extended to its intelligence gathering. Smith maintained relationships with telegraph operators who would alert him to incoming mining executives or land speculators, hotel clerks who reported on guests carrying large amounts of cash, and even ministers who would mention in casual conversation which parishioners had recently sold property or cattle. This network transformed random frontier encounters into targeted operations with success rates that approached industrial efficiency. Records suggest Smith's operation in Creede extracted between $15,000 and $20,000 monthly during the silver boom of 1891 to 1892, an extraordinary sum that reflected not just the scale of his fraud but the precision of his intelligence apparatus. The collapse of many frontier gambling operations came not from law enforcement, but from the same economic forces that made them profitable initially. When mining towns played out, cattle routes shifted, or railroad construction moved to new territories, the transient populations that sustained high-stakes gambling dried up. Creede's population declined from 8,000 in 1892 to less than 400 by 1895, and Smith's operation became unsustainable, not because authorities shut it down, but because there simply weren't enough marks to justify maintaining his employee network. He relocated to Skagway, Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush, where the same techniques worked until July 8, 1898, when he was killed in a shootout over access to gold being transported through town. The shooting emerged from competition between fraud organizations rather than conflict between law and lawlessness. Skagway had multiple groups attempting to systematically rob miners, and violence erupted over territorial control of the most profitable marks. The long-term social consequences of frontier gambling fraud extended far beyond individual losses and shaped institutional development in ways that remained visible for generations. Towns that had built municipal budgets around gambling revenue faced fiscal crises when changing demographics and improved law enforcement reduced that income. Dodge City's transition from cattle town to agricultural center in the late 1880s forced a reckoning with the fact that its civic infrastructure had been partially funded by systematized fraud. The city's beautiful school building and functioning water system had been paid for partly by taxes and licensing fees from saloons, where cheating was not just tolerated but expected. This created a moral hazard that haunted town leaders. Acknowledging the source of funding meant admitting complicity, but pretending the money was legitimate required sustained collective amnesia. The professional gamblers who survived long enough to see the frontier close faced a forced career transition that revealed the transferable skills of fraud. Many moved into legitimate business, applying their understanding of odds, risk management, and human psychology to enterprises like insurance, stock trading, and real estate development. Canada Bill Jones, before his death in 1880, had begun investing his gambling profits in Kansas City real estate, recognizing that the same ability to identify marks and assess risk that made him successful at three-card Monte could be applied to evaluating property values and finding buyers willing to overpay. George Duvall, who lived until 1903, ended his career as a consultant to law enforcement agencies, teaching police officers how to identify rigged gambling equipment and con artists. His technical knowledge of fraud mechanisms made him valuable in a new economy where systematic deception was migrating from saloons to stock exchanges and corporate boardrooms. The physical artifacts of frontier gambling fraud now reside in museum collections and offer material evidence of the gap between mythology and reality. The Smithsonian Institution holds several rigged faro boxes from 1870s Montana. An examination under modern imaging technology reveals mechanical sophistication that required precision machining. These were not crude devices assembled in saloon back rooms, but manufactured products that involved investment in metalworking tools, materials science, and design refinement. The existence of this manufacturing infrastructure demonstrates that frontier fraud operated at an industrial scale that integrated with legitimate commerce. The same machine shops that produced mining equipment and agricultural implements also produced cheating devices. The same express companies that shipped consumer goods also shipped marked cards, and the same newspapers that promoted settlement also carried advertisements for gambling equipment. The mythology that replaced this complex reality served specific purposes in the decades after the frontier closed, as Western states sought to attract investment and immigration in the early 20th century. Civic boosters promoted narratives that emphasized lawfulness and opportunity while minimizing the systematic fraud that had characterized the frontier economy. The transformation of gamblers from calculating predators into romantic figures happened through deliberate cultural production, dime novels, Wild West shows, and later Hollywood films that turned men like Luke Short and Doc Holliday into heroes rather than what they actually were, which was skilled practitioners of mechanical and psychological fraud. This reimagining served economic purposes by making Western history marketable to tourists and investors, but it obscured the actual mechanisms through which wealth was transferred and power was accumulated in frontier settlements. What remains striking when examining documented accounts of frontier gambling fraud is not how different the Old West was from modern America, but how similar the underlying dynamics remain. The techniques changed, the technology evolved, but the fundamental relationship between weak enforcement, transient populations, and systematic deception continues in context from online poker to cryptocurrency schemes. The frontier gamblers who followed migration routes with their rigged faro boxes and marked decks were doing what fraudsters have always done, positioning themselves at the intersection of opportunity and weak institutional oversight, using technical sophistication to create the appearance of legitimacy and moving on before consequences materialized. The spring-loaded holdout device that got Charlie Storms killed in 1881 was simply an earlier version of the same impulse that drives modern fraud, the belief that mechanical advantage can substitute for genuine skill and that detection can be postponed indefinitely. Understanding how gamblers actually cheated in Old West saloons means recognizing that the frontier was not a place where individual courage and quick draws determined outcomes, but rather an economic environment where systematic deception was woven into the fabric of daily commerce, shaping everything from town budgets to settlement patterns to the very definition of what frontier society considered acceptable business practice.